Thank you, Ms. Lazarakou. Thank you, Mr. Wioda and Ms. Kalamanidis for this very enlightening conversation. I'm sure everybody has enjoyed. So we're moving ahead. It's a pleasure to welcome to the podium Mr. Chris HODGE. He's an independent advisor on governance and regulation, director, governance and perspectives Ltd. From United Kingdom. Dear Mr. HODGE, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much. It's a great honour to be invited by the Chamber to talk to you today, particularly to give the keynote address when there are so many other more distinguished speakers and presenters and indeed members of the audience. I became a little less honoured when I saw I was being put on immediately after the Capital Markets Commission and the SEC, because I felt I would have a very hard act to follow, as indeed has proved the case. But as it happens, some of the things that they've just been talking about, and indeed some of the things that were mentioned in the opening remarks from Maria and others, are actually also themes I'm going to be talking about today. So hopefully there's a degree of reinforcing the messages that you've already heard. For me personally, it's unlike the Commissioner, I've been here many times. I first came to Athens on corporate governance business nearly 15 years ago, when I was invited to join the newly established Hellenic Corporate Governance Council, and I've been lucky enough to return many times, and some former colleagues are here today. And over that time, over the last 15 years or so, we've seen significant changes and challenges for boards of directors, not just here in Greece, but globally. And my view in the current situation is that some of the governance structures and processes that we rely on, starting with the board and working downwards, are coming under pressure and being stress tested in ways that we've arguably not seen happening before. So today I'm going to talk briefly about what I think is causing this, what the impact has been for boards, and maybe how companies and boards can try to respond to those challenges. There are four main ways in which things have changed for boards and directors since I joined the Corporate Governance Council here, all of which overlap to some extent. And they are firstly that boards have more responsibilities now, either formal responsibilities imposed by regulation or ones that they've chosen to take on for themselves. Linked to that, the expectations from regulators, shareholders and other stakeholders are more demanding and also more prescriptive. Thirdly, as it says in today's programme about the later session on AI, which we've already been hearing about, technology has become a defining boardroom issue, and it pervades every aspect of what boards do. And finally, the world has just become much more unpredictable. I was going to call it the business environment, but I think really we just mean the world. And that creates a great deal more uncertainty for companies. Starting with responsibilities, as I said, the list of matters which boards are expected to be responsible grows longer and longer. And they're also expected to be capable of dealing with not just a broader range of issues, but to be much more directly involved in their organisations to a much deeper level than was the case certainly 15, 20 years ago. Now, the rationale for the board assuming more direct responsibility is often entirely understandable, and some of these changes have been driven primarily by boards themselves. One example is a risk, where certainly 20 years ago when I was first getting involved in corporate governance was seen very much as a function for management. You might report to the board once a year with a risk register or something, but that was about it. I think now it's viewed correctly as being a core board responsibility, as we've increasingly understood that the biggest risks are outside the organisation, not within them in many cases. And we've seen a similar change in the thinking that's taking place in relation to what Maria described as the corporate culture and ethics, one of the themes of today's events. But obviously, as we've heard, regulation has been a major factor, particularly for large global and listed companies. For example, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive extends the board's responsibility for ethical behaviour beyond the company itself and across the whole supply chain, which is a major extension of the board's responsibilities. And regulators have taken lead on other issues like directors' remuneration, certainly in the UK and Europe, and, as we've heard, public reporting. And all of this contributes to an increase in the volume of regulation relating to boards' duties, And that volume is amplified if you're a board of a company that is working across markets, where you may find you have competing and sometimes conflicting regulatory requirements that you need to deal with. As we heard from the Commissioner in particular, but also from the Chair in the panel session just now, a lot of the aim of regulation is to increase boards' accountability. In the first instance, that's to shareholders, but there's now a much greater emphasis on accountability to stakeholders as well. And that's something that is increasingly common to see reflected in company law, corporate governance codes, and so on. I'm not going to argue against that. Obviously, I think it's entirely right that boards should think about the impact of their actions on employees, customers, local communities, and so on. But from the perspective of the board, it adds another element of complexity to decision-making. There are a number, I won't go into the detail, but there are for students of company law, if there are any such unexciting people here today, if you look at the way that the board's directors are defined in different European countries, they often talk about acting in the best interest of the members of the company or the company, and there are many ways of interpreting that, and the more active involvement of thinking about stakeholders adds difficulty to that decision-making. And from the board's point of view, it's not that they've been trading one set of views and impacts for another. Stakeholder pressure hasn't replaced shareholder pressure. That's still there, and if anything, that's grown as well over the time that we're looking at. And the presence of major international institutional investors from the UK, from the US, and others has been a big factor, as they've spread to other markets, and they've increased the influence of the proxy voting agencies, more recently ESG rating agencies, which many companies accused of taking a very much what they call a tick box approach that doesn't take account of the company's particular circumstances. And for boards, it doesn't end there. They're being bombarded by demands and opinions on all sides, and sometimes the loudest voice of all is public opinion, as exemplified by social media. It's often ill-informed, but you ignore it at your peril. And social media is just one of the many ways in which technology has impacted on companies. As we've heard, AI is the headline now, but it's by no means the first technology to have that disruptive impact. Mobile communications and the internet, including Y2K, I am old enough to remember that one, but have completely transformed the way we work over the last 30 years or so. As the Commissioner, I think, said, they also have the potential to enhance decision-making by enabling deeper and faster analysis, and also to facilitate shareholder and stakeholder engagement. And it's resulted in many new issues being added to the board's agenda, as we've heard. But the impact of AI in particular may be even greater. Some companies will need to fundamentally rethink their strategy, their business model, their products, services, and the ways they work if they're going to reap the potential benefits rather than to succumb to the threats. And that's just one example of the changes that's creating uncertainty for companies in the current environment. In recent years, disruption in one form or another seems to have become almost the default mode for business. Wars, pandemics, extreme weather events, trade disputes, all directly affect operations, supply chains, and the company's bottom line. If you add in environmental challenges, changes in demographics, in many countries increased social division, and you have a very uncertain environment that is going to challenge even the best of boards. Now, those of you who serve on boards, and I'm sure there are many of you here today, will know from direct experience that these developments have greatly increased both the volume and the complexity of the board's work. There was some recent research in the UK into what they call board packs. Those are the papers that directors receive for each board member, each board meeting, apologies. And this research found that more than half of the companies that were surveyed, and these include private companies, not just listed companies, had an average board pack of over 200 pages. Some of the worst ones, for example, in financial services, came to nearly 1,000 pages a meeting. And even the most capable and most diligent of directors is going to struggle with that. Similarly, in a survey last year by the National Association of Corporate Directors in the US, found that the time commitment of independent directors in public companies had increased by over 20% in the last 10 years. So those are just some indicators of the increased volume of work. The challenge also for boards collectively, as well as for individual directors, trying to find the mixture of skills and experience needed to help companies address this complexity and to anticipate future challenges is a great one, as is finding the appropriate resource in terms of skills and expertise, but also volume of the resource needed to support the board. You know, we heard on the panel discussion about using experts as an input to board discussions. Often you're looking at areas where those experts are thin on the ground and much in demand. So even that is not a straightforward solution to that challenge. But I think the particular thing I wanted to emphasize at this point in my remarks is that it's not just, I think, a case of the impact on the board's capabilities and capacity, but there has been a concern expressed by some commentators that some of these trends that I talked about are effectively undermining the board's ability to lead the company. A couple of years ago, I worked with the Institute of Directors in the UK on a report that asked a rather leading question, which was, are boards losing control? Now, my expectation had been that people would come back and say, oh no, you know, it's a challenge, it's a struggle, there's a lot more work. But to my surprise, quite a lot of the interviewers we spoke to said, actually, yes, they are, or some companies are. And they identified three main reasons that came out of these conversations. I don't necessarily agree with them all, but I'll share them with you for what they're worth. First, there's a perception that some boards had effectively abdicated their responsibility for setting the company's direction and strategy, and were instead simply trying to manage the expectations of regulators, investors, and other stakeholders, that they felt so bombarded by views that they felt it would be easier just to try and muddle along and meet those expectations as best they can, rather than actually provide proper leadership. Second, and I think this one probably is true, it was felt that many boards had failed to grasp the implications of some of the systemic challenges that are facing the companies in the longer term, AI being one, but some of the other challenges that I mentioned as well. And because they themselves had not understood the severity and the potential impact of these challenges, they weren't providing the leadership that the company really needed on how to address those challenges. And finally, and I think this one is undeniable, is that the extent and pace of the challenges that the companies are facing, and we did this survey, I think 2 years ago, so we're thinking of COVID, Ukraine, various other things that have been in the near past at that time. There were so many challenges and they were happening so quickly that many boards had been put on the back foot, and they were stuck in what you might call a reactive mode of decision making. They were responding to external events rather than looking to provide a clear path forward. And it's undoubtedly the case that the series of crises in recent years have meant that many boards of necessity have had to be reactive. You know, without the ability to respond to events, it's crucial to your short-term survival. If they hadn't taken that approach, they wouldn't still be here. But for the longer term, that on its own isn't going to be sufficient. If these companies are to thrive, not just survive, boards need to anticipate trends and developments that may impact on their business, not just the ones that they already know about, but the ones that may be coming 5-10 years down the line. And so they need to both identify and develop ways of meeting those challenges before they get there, not just react to them. And understandably, this is something that many boards struggle with. A survey by McKinsey of global business leaders in 2023 found that over 50% of them believe their companies were not well prepared to anticipate future shocks. And that's coming from the boards themselves, so who are normally more optimistic about their ability to deal with things. So if half of them felt it, they weren't up to the job, then it's probably more than half. So I'll sort of start drawing my conclusions now. I've identified 2 different pressure points for boards, I hope. The capacity to deliver on what's expected of them, and the challenge to their position as leaders of the company. So how can they respond? One way of addressing the first challenge is to find ways of increasing that capacity. You know, while the time commitment of directors has increased, the average number of board meetings has not for most companies. Most recent data across Europe, and I think there's no reason to believe it's differently elsewhere, shows that the average in most markets is still 6 to 8 meetings a year, which hasn't changed since I started getting involved in corporate governance 20 plus years ago. Now, is that sufficient, given the challenges I've described? And if not, what's the right way to try and address that problem? You know, more frequent board meetings, more use of board committees and advisors, or something else? And as the pace of change outside the company continues to increase and accelerate, our boards are able to respond quickly enough if most of the boards of business is still being carried out in scheduled meetings? Or do they need to find some more nimble way of working to ensure that a problem today is not parked for 2 months until the next board meeting, by which time the problem may have accelerated and increased? I don't have any answers to that, you'll be surprised to hear, but there is a need, I think, for collective thinking and imagination and innovation about the way that boards go about doing their work in the current climate. And boards obviously also need to make sure that they have the capabilities to enable them to make best use of that capacity. And this is something that's been touched on in the introductory remarks and on the panel. You know, many of the tools for doing so are already in boards' hands, regularly reviewing the skills and experience they need to make sure that they're not set up to deal with yesterday's problems, but to help manage tomorrow's problems, improving the quality and timeliness of information that they receive, including managing the size of that, so it's actually there's not too much there that boards actually can't physically read it, which is the case in many companies. And the sessions after lunch on succession planning and board evaluation are both very relevant to that aspect of the problem, and I look forward to hearing what those two panels will have to say. So that's, in some ways, that's the easy bit. I mean, it's not easy, but it's the easier bit, I think, resolving the capacity issue, because that's partly at least a practical problem for boards. I think re-establishing their mandate to lead the companies is almost an existential one, because it begs the question of what are the boards there for? But it's one that I think has to be tackled by boards. You know, and while some criticism of individual boards is fully justified, generally they're still best placed to take decisions on the long-term interests of companies rather than outsiders. And I think the sentiment for this is something that you sometimes hear said about democracy, which you invented here 2,500 years ago, as the Commissioner alluded to, that the way implies also to boards, they may not be perfect, but they're the best option we've got, so we need to make them work. And I think, crucially, going back to the first comment that was made by the commentators I mentioned for the report on whether boards are losing control about abdicating responsibility and being driven by what your stakeholders say, I think there's a big difference between listening to your stakeholders, which boards absolutely must do, and letting them take the decisions for you, which they should not. The most material issues to your company may not always be those that are being pushed by policymakers, regulators, rating agencies, or anyone else. You at the board level are the ones who should be, if you have the right skills and experience, be best able to identify them and address them. But I can understand why some boards find this a challenge if they themselves have not got a clear idea of what they're trying to achieve for the company. It's much harder to resist pressure to change course or adopt other people's agendas if the board hasn't set a firm direction or doesn't have a clear and well-defined purpose which provides a framework for their decision-making. So that, I think, for all boards has to be the starting point. And linked to that, boards may need to be more proactive in addressing systemic issues of the sort that I've mentioned that were being discussed in the panel, and demonstrating they're capable of doing that without waiting to be told they have to by regulators or investors. And that, again, has been reinforced what was said previously. That requires an understanding of which specific issues are most material for ensuring the company's long-term viability. An assessment that having a defined purpose can really help to underpin, because it provides, you would hope, a clarity of thought and a filter through which to address different issues. So that's what I think boards need to step up and be more active in those areas. In return, it would help if external influences such as regulators and shareholders could give boards more rooms to manoeuvre. And again, I think this reinforces one of the messages from the panel in particular. Obviously, regulators and shareholders need to continue to set minimum requirements, legitimate expectations, and so on. But ideally, without the numerous layers of prescription that we've seen added from different quarters, there should be more scope for directors of companies to exercise discretion and judgment on what they consider to be the company's long-term interest. So I'll draw to a close there and just say, in conclusion, I think there is an onus on boards to demonstrate that they are capable of exercising judgment wisely and deserving of the trust that they ask for. And there is an onus on policymakers, investors, and other stakeholders to find a way to exercise proper scrutiny of boards in a way that doesn't shackle them. It's difficult enough for directors to lead a company in the current climate without trying to do so with one hand tied behind their back. So thank you very much. Yeah.